minutes.
Minister, draconian rent increases for local authority tenants have been introduced by Tipperary County Council from the 2nd of July last. And I believe they've had no regard for the effects of these huge increases have on the tenants concerned. And they've been introduced also, Minister, without the specific approval of the local councillors, on the basis that management claim that the making of a differential rent scheme is a function for the manager and not for the elected members. Now, Section 31 of the Housing Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 2009 made the making and the revocation of a differential rent scheme a reserved function of local authority members. We know, however, that that provision in the Act was never introduced, despite promises that it would, way back as far as 2011. The provisions, a similar provision, or in fact the same provision, making the revocation or the making of a differential rent scheme a reserve function to local authority members was included in the Local Government Reform Act of 2014. And as you understand, Minister, that was on the basis that government was delegating to local councillors new functions at the same time as the local councils, town councils and borough councils were being abolished. There's now apparently confusion as to whether that provision in the Local Government Act of 2014 is actually operational. I have a statutory instrument, a copy of a statutory instrument here, Minister, which would seem to suggest that that Act is operable. And it's statutory instrument number 214 of 2014 in the name of the then Minister Phil Hogan, Minister for Environment, Community and Local Government. And one section of that order states that the first day of June 2014 is appointed as the day on which the Local Government Reform Act 2014, number 1 of 2014, insofar as it is not already in operation, comes into operation. Minister, the increases, as I said, are draconian. I have numerous examples here. One that would give you a flavour of the type of increases that have been introduced is a family of 4, 2 young children, both husband and wife on social welfare income, one on carers allowance. Their rent has gone from €39.80 to €91.80, €52 per week or €208 per month. And I have a number of similar cases as well, sheafs of them in fact here, Minister. As I say, these are absolutely draconian increases and they should be reversed, and indeed must be reversed. And I want to ask you today, first of all, to confirm what is the position in relation to the making of a differential rent scheme. Is it a reserve function? Is it not a reserve function? If it's not a reserve function to the elected members now, when will it be made a reserve function as set out in the 2009 and the 2014 Act? Because it's obvious that management and councils throughout the country are now using this confusion to impose huge, savage increases on local authority tenants. Margaret.
Minister, it's 4 minutes.
Thank you. As Concorda, I want to thank Deputy Healy for raising the matter and taking it on behalf of my colleague Minister Murphy, and thank him for giving me the opportunity to discuss and outline the current position. In relation to his last question, my understanding is it's not currently a reserved function for local authority members. On the issue of the statutory instrument 214 of 2014, I'll try to get an answer as to the effectiveness of that in terms of the Differential Rent Scheme. Section 31 of the Housing Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2009, which has not been commenced, provides that the Minister may make regulations providing for matters to be included in a rent scheme to be made by a housing authority, including the manner in which the financial circumstances of households and their ability to pay rent shall be taken into account in determining rent, including the level, type and sources of household income that may be assessed for the purposes of determining rents, the manner in which adjustments may be made to the rent in respect of any obligations imposed on the tenant under the tenancy agreement relating to the maintenance of the dwelling, the amount or method of calculation of any allowances in respect of rent which may be made for dependents, and the procedure for rent reviews during the period of a tenancy having regard to any changes in household circumstances or income levels. Section 31(7) of the Housing Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2009 provides for, among other things, the making or revocation of a rent scheme to be a reserved function. However, as indicated earlier, this section has not yet been commenced. The practice of a national differential rent scheme was abandoned in 1986 when rent setting was devolved completely to individual housing authorities, subject to broad principles laid down in departmental guidance. Housing authorities are also empowered under Section 58 of the Housing Act 1966 to include charges in the rent relating to the costs of works and services provided to dwellings under the Housing Act. The current situation involves a disparate approach across housing authorities to rent setting for accommodation that is funded wholly by the Exchequer. While all housing authorities charge rents related to household income, similar households in similar accommodation are charged varying amounts of differential rent depending on which local authority is setting the accommodation, is letting the accommodation. Individual authorities also differ on issues like the types and amounts of income that are reckonable for differential rent purposes. On that basis, it is recognised that a greater degree of national uniformity needs to be introduced. Considerable work has been carried out by the Department in developing a national rents framework, including common income thresholds and common income disregards. The new system aims to be more equitable and transparent, with regulations setting out a common method for determining household income across the country for rent purposes. This work has now been examined further in the light of a broader commitment given the Rebuilding Ireland Action Plan for Housing and Homelessness to review the disparate systems of differential rent for social housing in place across local authorities. The objective is to ensure that housing supports are fair and sustainable, prioritise those on lowest incomes and avoid creating welfare traps that may prevent people from either returning to work or to the private housing market. Minister Murphy expects that the results of the review will be available shortly, and on foot of which he will consider the appropriate next steps.
2 minutes, Deputy Healy.
Thanks for the response, but look, it's the usual department script. We really need to know why, after 9 years from the 2009 Act, why this making the scheme is not a reserved function, why it hasn't been introduced 9 years after that, 4 years after the 2014 Act. Why is the making of a scheme not reserved to the members as set out in those acts? And I would ask you also to clarify the situation regarding to SI 214 of 2014, that particular statutory instrument, because the increases, Minister, that have been introduced are absolutely horrendous. I've given you one there which is more than 100% of an increase, but there's numerous others. And what has happened is that there's a new method of assessing joint incomes of joint tenants or partners or spouses, and imposes a 20% rather than a 10% assessment on additional income. Also, if in many cases you have a husband and wife or spouses or partners, one of them with a half-rate carers, and this new system reduces the €107 per week of the half-rate carers by £21.40, takes 20% off that, and these are for carers who are looking after their spouse or partner on a 24/7 basis and are being effectively cut by 20%. Very similar situation with family income supplement, where you have workers on very low incomes are entitled entitled to family income support, they're losing 20% of that in these new rent regulations. So, Minister, these increases are horrendous. I really want to know when the scheme is going to become a reserve function. As I said, it's in 2 pieces of legislation going back 9 years. So when is it going to be introduced? We've heard promises before, but they haven't been.
All right. Thank you, Deputy. We'll hear the answer now.
When are we going to have this reserve function introduced at last?
Minister.
The only answer I can give the Deputy is that the review undertaken by Minister Murphy and by his officials on his behalf, the results of it are imminent, and following on from that, a more uniform system of differential rent, a scheme for that will be introduced. That's the proposal of government. You'll have to, I'm not sure why the original proposal from the original legislation in 2009 hasn't become law yet. I will endeavour to find out. You can't just expect to ask me on the floor of the House about an SI 214 from 2014 and that I would know, and that anyone would know the answer off the top of their head. But I will get the answer to that particular question. But in relation to the review, its results are imminent, and the Minister has indicated that he will act on that. It is unfair that there isn't a common yardstick for different types of income in the calculation of differential rents across the different local authorities in the country. You're right to point that out, and that's what the review, or one of the main purposes of the review. But it all stems from the fact that the common scheme disappeared in 1986 and was replaced by individual rent setting by housing authorities. There are 31 of them at present. There would have been a lot more of them in 1986. And the purpose of the review, which the Minister will act on, is to ensure that the same broad standards and the same system would apply in terms of calculating differential rents in Tipperary County Council, as in Kilkenny County Council, as in every other local authority in the country. I'll revert directly to the member with regard to the statutory instrument 214 that he mentioned.